Hello, and welcome to the SMU Video Archive series. In this series, we interview members of the SMU community who provide insight into the history of SMU, especially from the perspective of their time at the university. I'm Carter Murphy, and with us today is Gene Byrne, former professor of organizational behavior and the former associate dean of the School of Business. Gene, you are much associated with the deanship of Jack Grayson because you and he came at the same time. What were the circumstances of your coming to SMU?
I was associate dean at Tulane at the time.
And Jack was dean.
Jack was dean. I had spent approximately 10 years with Jack, from student to research associate. He was my dissertation advisor when I got a PhD in the Humanities and Sciences department. I had asked for him in the business school and they agreed. So I'd known Jack for a long time, and we spent a year together in Switzerland, where he was a professor and I was a research associate. So I was just energized by being around Jack Grayson. And I was just settling into the associate dean's job at Tulane when Jack came in and said, I think I'm going to accept the position of dean at the Southern Methodist University Business School. And I said, fine. I was a little disappointed, but he said, I'd like you to go with me as associate dean. And I jumped at the chance. I wasn't sure about where the school was exactly, even though my son was named Kyle, for obvious reasons. But I jumped at the chance just to continue to work with Jack. And so in the summer of '68, I came, and Jack had a previous engagement, so he showed up in September, and I kind of laid a little ground for him.
How did SMU find Jack?
I'm not exactly sure. I do know that both Ed Cox and Bill Clements, Bill was chairman of the Board of Trustees, and Ed was chairman of the board of the Cox School Trustee Committee. I knew that they had a major hand in his being interviewed and coming over here and talking with business people. I suspect that some faculty member may have given the name to the provost and the president, and they, of course, played a major role. President Tate and Provost McFarland played major roles in Jack, but the business people were very, very significant in that process.
Bill Clement and Ed Cox were powerful trustees, their judgment would have been difficult to override, I'm sure.
Exactly.
Now, you came, along with Jack, also John Dutton.
Yes.
And the three of you, I remember you as the triumvirate in those early days.
Yes, we hung out pretty steadily together. John was a classmate of Jack's at Harvard. And Jack was a finance and decision theorist type person. That was his field of study. John was an organizational behaviorist, and I was an economist. So between the three of us, Jack was very pleased to get John, who was at the Krannert School at Purdue at the time. He was a professor there, and Jack said, would you come down for a few years and help us try and do something significant here at SMU? And John was kind of like me. He accepted Jack's offer. So the three of us came together in the fall of '68.
What do you think was the charge to Jack and the whole team that came in?
That's a good question. It was never very specific. I think Jack, in talking with Bill Clements and Ed Cox and the president and the provost, he got the very clear message that good would not be good enough. They wanted something special. They didn't know how to go about it. They respected Jack's expertise. He had a good track record at different places. But they really expected something special. They didn't put a time frame on it. They didn't promise him any specific level of financial support. They just said, we know you're the best man for the job and that you'll marshal the resources and make SMU one of the regionally prominent and nationally significant schools of business. And that was about as specific as I can recall.
Going back just a little bit, what had Jack to bring to the table? What had he done as dean at Tulane that attracted attention?
Very interesting. He was he became later known, and we'll talk about it, became known for dramatic change and innovation here at SMU. At Tulane, he had inherited a school with a very strong faculty. They were strong in research. They were strong in teaching. They had a very big graduate program. Jack did introduce a PhD program in management science, and he allowed people to innovate. That was one of the things that attracted people. So he was known as an innovator in academic circles, and he was kind of known as a doer. So he was able to raise funds and create new programs and attract good people, but he was not known for the kinds of things that he eventually became known for here.
Well, we'll get into that,
Okay.
I hope. How did you assess the situation at SMU when you came?
Well, when we first came with the idea in mind of doing something really significant, Jack, myself, and John, with our different backgrounds, took a careful look at the faculty and decided that their real strength was teaching. Virtually everyone they hired and retained was an excellent teacher. It was largely an undergraduate school. I think we had anywhere between 12 and 1,400 undergraduates. The student body we thought was average in terms of statistics that we had. And we did also think that they were underpaid on a relative basis. That was one of the things that made that a problem, was that in order to kind of earn a really good living, as they should, a lot of them did a lot of consulting. So that had a major impact on research. So we had an outstanding group of teachers who did not do a lot of research, although the economics department, which was in the business school at the time, was the exception to that. There were some outstanding researchers in the economics department, but by and large it was a teaching faculty with a large undergraduate program, and I think we only had 25 graduate students. We thought we were underfunded from a university perspective. We thought we ought to perhaps get a little bigger share of the pie. And we thought the physical facilities at the time were adequate, but we knew that.
What about relations with the Dallas business community?
There was very much going on at the time. Swigsby, the Graduate School of Banking, which was not in the business school, but most people thought it was, they had a very good relationship with the business community, and lots of people thought that that was the way we related. But we did a few little programs when we first got here. There were a few little programs that were done, but not a whole lot, Carter, was done with the business community when we first arrived.
Well, I think that was a widespread feeling throughout the university, that the School of Business remained a sleeping potential giant in the midst of a dynamic business community.
Exactly.
But that the relationship had not yet been built. I'm sure that must have been part of the charge that Jack saw for himself.
Ed Cox and Bill Clements, both being very, very successful businessmen, challenged Jack to marshal the resources of the business community, and they offered to help in any way that they could, and they did. They were very, very generous in sharing all of their contacts and taking Jack around. So he got a good head start on being into the business community through those two people.
Gene, you and Jack and John hit the ground running, but there were planning sessions. You had to scout out the lay of the land. Tell us about that.
Hey, that's well, you know, when you have the obvious resources of SMU and Dallas and the rest of the university and some very good people inside the business school, you say, well, where can we go? What's the competitive landscape? Well, you look out there and you see Harvard has already taken the case approach to studying business, and they had a lot of following. There was virtually no room at the inn in that arena. Carnegie Tech and MIT and the University of Chicago and Purdue had taken over the quantitative approach and had a lot of followers, and we couldn't see any room in that space. Stanford had come along not too long after that and decided to marry the behavioral and the quantitative and the senior strategic planning approach. So they had sewn up that arena. There was no room. We didn't think we had an opportunity to break into the upper echelons and gain regional and national prominence by playing the game.
Being a copycat.
We couldn't be a copycat, and we didn't have the funds. If we had a lot of money, we could have done it, but nobody promised us money on the front end. So we sat down and literally a year-long planning session, Jack and I and John, along with people like Frank Millar, who was Associate Dean for Undergraduate Affairs, and Billy Watson, who was Associate Dean for Administrative Affairs. But generally, Jack and I and John sat down and said, where can we go? What niche can we serve and make a mark for ourselves and the business school? And what we thought is both Jack and John came from Harvard, which is noted for its practical education. I was an undergraduate engineer and in the maritime field, and spent a year at sea as part of my training. And so all of us had an affinity for practical learning as a way to become good in your field. So all of a sudden it seemed to be that just emerged as a possibility, and we looked out into the world of business education and we didn't see any clinical, experiential, real project-based learning, and we said, okay, that's what we'll try. We'll try action learning as a pedagogical approach. Bring business, faculty, and students together around real problems. Let the students learn from the faculty and the business people, get credit for that. Faculty would have an opportunity to learn from business and students and do some research a la the Harvard School, and the business people would get access to resources they wouldn't ordinarily have, and we thought it would be a win-win situation for everybody. So that's how we kind of hitched our start to the action learning approach.
We have to fill this out, but before we do, Gene, you and Jack undertook some symbolic things. One I remember was Gilding the Dome on the School of Business.
We did.
Who paid for that?
As I was leaving for SMU from Tulane, Jack said, "Oh, by the way, one of the things I want you to do is to go over to the provost and ask him to gild the dome." And I was a little bit puzzled, but he said, "I've been to that campus a number of times, and I've noticed that all the good schools have domes, and they're all gilded. We have a dome, and it's not gilded. I would like everybody to know that we are going to be a significant force on campus." So that's a symbol, and I know people are going to raise their eyebrows, but ask Neil in your very best way to gild the dome as a favor to me. And Neil said, okay, wasn't quite sure but he understood the symbolism. Being a religion professor, he understood the symbolism.
This is Neil McFarland,
and
who was then
paid
provost.
For it.
Yeah, and
He
paid for it. Did
Yes,
he?
he did.
I didn't know.
Yes, he
I'll
did.
have to accuse him of that. It attracted a great deal of attention around the campus.
It wasn't all positive either.
I must admit,
That's
no,
right.
not all.
Not all positive.
There was also this famous meeting of this human relations meeting. What was it called?
It's called a marathon. The technique was a behavioral science technique called a marathon. It's a technique for putting people in a room together and not letting them out until they've understood each other's values and beliefs and teaching styles and research and life goals. And so you put a facilitator in the room with anywhere from 10 to 12 people, and you mix businessmen and SMU administrators and faculty and students, and the facilitator is charged with the responsibility of having people kind of open themselves up. The goal of the marathon sessions, wherever they're held, is to create a sense of community more quickly than you would if you just let it evolve. It's kind of a jump start to building a community and a team.
It also, however, can can arouse or enliven hostilities, I suppose.
It can, and it did. We had a few people. Yes,
I remember tales of Willis Tate having been cornered and being unhappy with his experience, but I have that
true.
not firsthand.
I think what happened, Carter, was that we understood it to be a very well understood technique, and therefore we failed to explain it properly to people we invited outside of the field of business. Mm-hmm. And even inside, some of the people didn't know. So I think we were quite guilty of not explaining. So after the first day, we lost a few people from our marathon. And the second day was more people who were enamored with the technique and enjoyed the experience. And I think President Tate didn't have the best experience there. We owed him one for that. I'm sure. But he was a gentleman and a scholar, and he helped us at all points.
Yeah. Well, I was greatly disappointed. My children brought mumps home from the school, and I developed a good case and missed the whole affair.
Yeah. You were chairman of the Department of Economics.
I was chairman of Economics.
Yeah,
at that
I'm sure
point.
we were missing you at that session.
Well, I'd like to have been there.
Mm-hmm.
Gene, now, so much for the symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
You and John and Jack were planning, and it was to be innovative, and it was to be action-oriented. What became of all this? What kind of actions began to take place?
Well, at every turn, Jack encouraged faculty members to go out, find businessmen if they didn't know people because they were new to the school. We would make contact with them, and we generally made it known to the business community that if they wanted some help in solving real problems, we were available, and that we were going to do it in the context of helping students learn and potentially providing some research opportunities for faculty. So we put out the clarion call in a number of different ways, and we had a great response. I mean, we had people come by and talk with us. We went so far as to establish something called the Business Clinic, where people could come in and say, here's my problem, and the director of the clinic, I think the first director was Ron Walker, who was a business law professor, but was also a consultant, and Ron would direct people to faculty members or contact them. So we were constantly putting faculty and students and business people together and working our action learning model. That was the primary vehicle for doing that. There were other innovations that we can talk about. But
did these emerge as courses, Gene?
They did. Sometimes, for example, a student would sign up for 6 hours of independent study, let's say with Gene Byrne. And the independent study would be my assessment of their learning on a project that they might spend 3/4 of their time downtown with the business people, and they would come back and report to me. I would see the products of their work. I would talk to the business people, ask them how well they did. Were they professional? Were they content oriented? Did they do a good job? Were they timely? Various criteria. And at the end of the semester, I would assign a grade, and then I would talk with the business people about how well did the project go? Do they want to sign up for another one, et cetera. But and sometimes it was in the context of a given course. Tom Barry might take his class, and a company would come in and present them with an advertising problem, and he would divide his class up into groups, and they would make presentations at the end of the semester on advertising programs for that particular company, and Tom would assess the quality of their work. But the key was to get them working on real problems as opposed to case type or other types of unreal problems. We wanted them on real problems. That was our hallmark.
But no, a good deal was done in a structural way. And I must admit, my first real contact with Jack Grayson was a breakfast one morning in August of that year when Jack arrived, and before the bacon and eggs arrived, Jack announced that he wanted the Department of Economics out of the School of Business, where we had been situated for 15 years, I guess. Not always happily, but we had been situated there. And in fact, at that point, we were physically in the Fincher building, which was the School of Business.
Right.
Why did that come about?
Well, business draws on lots of disciplines for their basic raw material to develop ideas for solving problems. So psychology is a very important tool for business people. Statistics is a very important tool. Mathematics is a very important tool. One of the most closely related, of course, is economics. It almost sounds synonymous with that. But Jack thought that if we were going to be a practical, business-oriented, action-learning program, he wanted the disciplines to be housed in their respective arenas, which for us at Tulane was Humanities and Science. And with a lot of trepidation, I know he went to you and had talked with the provost, and he wanted the different related departments to be in the Arts and Sciences division. So that was the genesis, even though some people thought we were doing ourselves a disservice since we were asking what many people considered to be the best department in the business school to move out, and I think they had a lot of good things to say about that. But that was Jack's view. We wanted to be known as a primary practical problem-solving group.
Well, Jack had no equivocation about the matter, and we were, of course, moved to Humanities and Sciences. I think most of my colleagues were not unhappy with that move. I personally was not, though we did have to scramble to find new space on a campus where all the space is always occupied. Right. What else structurally took place?
Two big things took place. Curriculum was one.
Yeah.
We decided that if students were going to be asked to solve lots of business problems and act in very, very many ways like junior business executives, we thought we would ask them to become responsible for their own education and their own decisions about their education. So we introduced, after probably a year and a half of curriculum planning and a curriculum committee, we introduced a curriculum which had a single 3-hour requirement at the undergraduate level. None of the traditional courses, accounting, marketing,
all of which had previously been required courses.
All had been required. The AACSB, our accrediting agency, had very, very specifics. You must teach X, Y, and Z. And we introduced a non-required curriculum except for one course, which was to introduce them to their new responsibility of becoming responsible for their own education. How could we expect them to do this? We spent an entire 3-hour credit course teaching them how to become more responsible, where the resources were, what the decisions were, what consequences might be. And then we said, okay, now it's your turn. You have to decide. Do you want to take 6 courses in accounting and none in finance, or vice versa, or why would you not want to take a marketing class? But we put the full responsibility for the education of these students directly on themselves.
I mean, that's a heavy responsibility for students who probably didn't know what they needed. Most students don't. One can't know what one's missing until one has tasted it. Was there a counseling program instituted to help students in these problems?
There was. Every faculty member was expected to understand that the students had this responsibility. They were expected to devote, I believe it was 10% of their time to counseling. They would be evaluated on their counseling, and they were expected to learn lots about the other courses, about the rest of the school, about business, and so that they could advise people who said, well, who would make a decision, for example, not to take a marketing class and concentrate in some other areas. So the faculty members were expected to be responsible counselors to students.
Students came to the School of Business at that time, as now, I suppose, as juniors typically. Yes. They had taken their first 2 years in H&S.
Right.
And then so they took this introductory course when they were juniors in university. But thereafter, their curriculum was of their own building, together with an advisor.
Yes, they could take, as a matter of fact, they could take as much as 40% of their work outside the business school, in the communications arena, the economics department, art history. We were of the opinion that did not know what makes a good business curriculum. We knew we had a potpourri of courses, and that if the student was motivated to learn, either by being exposed to business or counseling with faculty, that motivation was at least as important to their development as our telling them take this course or that course. We relied very heavily on them being motivated to learn and accepting the responsibility for their own education.
In fact, seen from the perspective of my department in economics, we had the impression that the business students increased their participation in the School of Business courses rather than reaching out to the whole university. And I at the time thought that was a substantial loss in the education of some of our undergraduates. I'm not sure how long that persisted.
I would agree. I think one of the biggest problems you have when you let people make their own decisions is that they don't always make them the way you would think. Being an economist and knowing its value in solving business problems, I always encourage people to think about going outside, but in the final analysis, they made their own decisions. And I think over time, especially when we increased the size of the graduate program, I think that made students more aware of the value of courses in economics and psychology. But early on, you were right. I think some of them may have abused the privilege a little bit and stayed a little bit too much at home.
But it's true that those students were already professionally motivated when they came to the School of Business.
They were.
And I think they were eager for professional education, which no doubt explains a part of that. What about the MBA program, Gene? What was happening there?
Well, when we got here, we only had about 25 students. A lot of them were part-time, and there was just not a whole lot of activity in that. It was not accredited at all. The undergraduate program, by the way, had been accredited since way, way back. One of the first programs in business to be accredited anywhere. We can talk about that.
One of the charter members of the
yes,
AACSB.
Yes, we were. The MBA program had never sought accreditation for all different kinds of reasons. But we knew that the MBA program was one of the ways we were going to become regionally recognized and nationally recognized. You probably couldn't do it with an undergraduate program, no matter how good you were. Excuse me. So we decided to start pouring some resources into the MBA program. And we had a standard two-year MBA program. Fall, spring, take off in the summer, fall, spring, and graduate. And again, we looked out there and we said, the field is very crowded. If we just try to compete with everybody else, we can't win. And with Jack's innovative streak, he said, well, what would you like to do to make a mark in the MBA arena? And a lot of us felt, and Jack made it clear to us in a lot of discussions, that the information explosion was making it more and more difficult to pack all you knew into a two-year program. You were beginning to have to leave things out within a curriculum. So we decided that rather than try to pack a curriculum full of information which was exploding and wouldn't work in a couple of years anyway, we decided we would try and introduce basic business concepts, but then to make people very responsible again for their own learning, to take responsibility for how they learn and to become adept at learning, because 5 years after they were out, whether they were from Harvard or Carnegie or SMU, half of the information they had was going to be useless, and they were going to have to learn how to learn new information. So we decided to try and introduce as much as we could learning how to learn into the MBA curriculum. We asked faculty members to design courses not only to teach finance and marketing and accounting, but to be very, very conscious of the fact that the information would be changing, and how do you learn how to learn? So with that, we said, we think we can do that in a year. We don't need 2 years for that. So all of a sudden, we had a practically based MBA that was oriented toward learning how to learn and was only 1 year in length. And we knew we could attract students because that would save an average student $75,000 of tuition, and they could go to work a year earlier than if they were somewhere else. It was a challenge to our faculty to try and do that, and most of them responded.
How unique was that, Gene, at that point? Were there other one-year MBA programs in existence that were pioneering the way, or was this an opening gun? They're now common, I think.
The only one we knew about, and I don't know whether we knew about it, was the University of Pittsburgh. And to be quite honest, I think we were, if not first, we were close to being first to market with a new approach to the MBA, and we weren't accredited, so we didn't have to worry about it at the moment. So we kind of appeared on the scene with a program that made academicians and business people and kind of open their eyes and go, what is that all about? So Jack and Bobby Lyle were asked to speak about it a lot, and we were able to attract some very, very talented students who agreed with the approach that we were taking.
Gene, the whole action-oriented thing and bringing business people to the school with problems, for example, that could be used on which students could cut their teeth, was an outreach to the business community. But I'm sure that you were busy building those relationships with the business community in other ways.
Yes.
What all was taking place in that connection?
Right. Bobby Lyle was an assistant dean early on. Jack and I both spotted Bobby Lyle as a very interesting, active, innovative guy, and he didn't have a PhD. He was an instructor, but every time you turned around, there was Bobby Lyle asking what's going on and how can I help. So Jack made him assistant dean for something, probably student affairs. And next thing you know, Bobby walked into Jack's office and said, I know a man named Ray Hunt. He works for Hunt Industries, and his dad is very well known. It's the same family. But I know Ray very well, and we'd like to put together an advisory board of young businessmen and women. Not the top tier, that's the Clements and Cox people. There are a whole bunch of people out there who we think would be just absolutely delighted to help out if they were given an opportunity. So Ray and Bobby Lyle formed the advisory board. And in the very first year, they invited, I forget how many they invited, but they had a group of about 50 men and women who were told that they would be asked to come in and help find projects and be advisors to students and be mentors to students, and that they wouldn't be involved in fundraising. That was made very clear. No fundraising. Join us and don't worry about us asking you for money. We need your help more than we need your money. We're going to put that on a different level. So that was a program that's still in existence today. And Bobby Lyle, by the way, is currently chairman of the advisory board. Bobby Lyle, of course, now later became a trustee of SMU after he left the university. Yes, he did.
And has been a very effective one.
But he did, and that program has now made its way down to the undergraduate level. It was originally formed just to operate at the graduate level. We didn't know how many people we would get to do the work, so we started just at the graduate level and ended up with it now at the undergraduate level as well.
Ray Hunt was, at that point, still a reasonably recent graduate of SMU.
He was.
He had been an economics major.
Yes.
I remember him very much as a golden boy as an economics student.
Yes, he was.
Bright and affable.
Yes.
And
still is.
A wonderful man, still is.
Yes, he is, still is.
All the more so.
Exactly.
Now, this group was called, the Lyle Hunt group was called the
Advisory Board.
The Business Advisory Board.
The Business Advisory, and they advised the dean. The good part about them was they were so active, you could call upon them. You could get 10 members to come out to a meeting at 7 o'clock at night if you were a professor thinking about some wacky idea, and ask them what they thought, and they would come out and they'd give you their opinion. Sometimes they'd give you their help, and it was a wonderful resource. In many, many, many ways, Carter, I think, over the years, the SMU Business School has become known for that particular relationship. It's a remarkable, you couldn't do it in Lawrence, Kansas, where a friend of mine was dean of the the business school. You couldn't do that. And we couldn't do it in New Orleans. We tried to get close to the business community, but Bobby and Ray, they somehow understood that there was a cadre that would come and help, and they certainly did.
Well, this was critical. It had never occurred before in any substantial degree at SMU. I think the relationship was entirely a distant one.
Exactly.
And that was a major contribution.
It was.
Was not the business briefing, those meetings, were they not established at that time?
You put your finger on another major way that the business school related to the business community. Again, Bobby Lyle was in the middle of this, and we had a director of institutes, a man named Fred Lee, who had come to us from the American Management Association, used to putting on seminars, and he said, why don't we go out and find out whether or not, what do business people want from the school? And one of the things they said, well, you know, we don't often get an opportunity to talk to some of the best minds or hear from the best minds in business and academia. Excuse me. So they said, well, how about if we have a quarterly management briefing, and we bring prominent people to the community? What do you think? Then they said, well, it's worth a try. So as it happened, Jack Grayson was not in town at the time. He was in Washington, and we can talk about that. So they said, well, let's have a business briefing, and we'll invite the Price Commissioner to come. And gosh, they had 1,000 people at the Fairmont Hotel, and they all paid a lot of money to hear him speak.
Yes.
And we said, well, that's interesting. So we kept trying it, and as it turned out, we used to
Price Commissioner was Jack at that point.
Price Commissioner, what? He was on leave.
Yeah.
We can talk.
We'll come to that. But
yes, he was the Price Commissioner under Nixon.
But he was the man everyone wanted to hear.
Everybody wanted to hear it. We had a coup. We had the inside track. He came here, and we filled the Fairmont dining room and to overflow, and we made a lot of money off that. And and we also, the business community found it very valuable. And we said, well, gosh, that sounds good. So we started inviting people like the Secretary of Commerce and the Chairman and CEO of Citibank. And at one point during Alan Coleman's reign, we had Milton Friedman, who had recently won the Nobel Prize.
Yes.
And we constantly had people of that ilk. And I think that is now renamed into the SMU Business Forum. But it continues today. It was very, very successful. And it provided an additional source of revenue for the university and for the business school. And it was another way that the community let it be known that we were in close concert with their goals as well as our own.
But you fellows were revolutionaries in many ways. You not only had swept away the entire curriculum and all required courses, well, not the curriculum, but required courses in any case, restructured all of that. You also, this was the end of the 60s. Students were involved in, were demanding involvement in university governance. And you answered that, as I remember.
That's true.
And involved students in high-level decision-making in the school.
We did. That was another. Again, we were asking the students to be responsible for their own education, we thought we ought to share the responsibility for managing the educational process. So we created something called the Business School Assembly. And it consisted of all faculty members, full-time, a few part-time faculty members, some administrative staff, and 30% of the Business School Assembly was students elected by their peers. And they had a vote in this assembly. And the assembly was charged with making all the policy decisions in the school, all the curriculum decisions in the school. They made personnel decisions on tenure qualifications. They didn't make decisions on the tenure themselves, but they approved the criteria for tenure, criteria for promotion, and the 30% of the students that were in the Business School Assembly, they had the same vote as I did, and the same vote as the dean, same vote as a full professor. So we had shared responsibility, as you say, as a product of that time. So we said, okay, you're in.
Did problems emerge out of that, Gene, as to your recollection?
It actually, it was
I suspect the
surprisingly
students behave
smooth.
very responsibly.
You know, one of the fears that a lot of people had was, well, the students they're gonna get together, and with their 30%, they'll divide the faculty and they'll try and run. Well, it didn't work that way. They were very responsible. Every committee I ever served on, and I served mostly on curriculum committees, and I had students, you could count on them for being very, very responsible. They didn't squander their vote. They were on time. They did their homework for the committee, and they were outstanding. I had never once had a regret. They didn't always agree with, and I couldn't overpower them in any shape or form but it was excellent. That was wonderful. And it continued through Alan Coleman's reign. I think it began to wane when Dean Herberger came and began to change things. I
can't quite imagine Herberger being responsive to that. Yes.
I left 1 year after Roy came, so I wasn't aware of how that whole process came, but it stayed on for quite a while, and it when you have the students helping to make the decisions, you have a very, very cohesive, active student body. They do things that distant student bodies might not do. Mm-hmm. Very helpful.
Gene, if that worked out well, not everything did. You can't upset the apple cart and expect a few things not to be spilled where you don't want them.
That's true.
What kind of problems emerged out of all of this?
Well, there were problems, Carter. There were a number of faculty who were here who were full professors doing their job very well, getting very, very good student ratings. And all of a sudden they were asked to do things very, very differently. And to be honest, we didn't have as much patience as we might have had with them. We didn't give them as much time to try to innovate and change as we could. We were very, very quick to say, either be with us or against us. With the annual raises was one way to do that. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence, some of the more well-known professors were kind of moved toward the side, and so there became what came to be known as old guard, new guard, and
with a good deal of bitterness.
And there was a good deal of bitterness, and especially including among the younger faculty who were here when we came, even though they were able to move over and perform in this innovative environment that Jack and the rest of us were wanting. They were able to do that. They sometimes were very bitter and disappointed, and rightfully so, about some of the ways the older faculty weren't able to participate. Sometimes we used various techniques to help to buy people out, and in order to make it reasonable. And some people, they honestly just up and left. Not always with a good taste.
I had the impression that it did sap the productivity of especially the so-called old guard deeply, and that was costly.
I had a conversation with Jack Grayson about 3 years ago, and I asked him what was his biggest regret. His biggest regret was not being able to bring everybody into it, being more patient and perhaps doing things just a mite slower. And he said the old guard, new guard was his biggest regret.
Well, that's interesting. But now you had removed all the requirements in the curriculum, which were, and those requirements were stipulated by the AACSB, the accrediting agency.
They were.
How did they react?
Well, they came by for a 5-year review, and they raised their eyebrows and asked us, what's going on here? And we pointed to a rather obscure provision in their requirements, which said that if you had an innovative program that was making a special contribution to business education, it would be evaluated on its own merits. And we grabbed onto that as our banner and waved it at them as they came by looking for required courses, and they went, well, okay, that's true. We do have that requirement or that provision. But we're going to withhold our accreditation until we kind of see how it's going. So we want an annual report from you. So we submitted an annual report a little bit late usually to kind of buy more time to make sure the thing was working. And after about one or two of those, we got a note from the senior official at the AACSB saying, we really don't think it's appropriate for you to continue in this manner. We think you need to reassess your position and let us know what you're going to do about that.
There was an old guard at the AACSB also.
There was an old guard at the AACSB also. So we tried to fight a holding action to see if we couldn't marshal some support among new guard members of the AACSB, and we were able to do that, but never quite convincingly. And then, of course, we had the huge problem of Jack Grayson taking a leave of absence right about the time that became an issue.
Yeah. And
so Bobby Lyle was left with the trying to justify what we were doing. And then, at one point, Bobby Lyle, without a PhD and hoping for an academic career, decided to take a leave of absence at 75. So he left and went off to Amherst to get a degree. And so we were without a real primary leader. Jack had come back from being the Price Commissioner for 18 months, but he was enamored with the idea of productivity and was working mostly on that. And so Alan Coleman agreed to be executive dean. He had come in 74 as a chaired professor. But we didn't have much going for us. We were really without a leader, and the AACSB was putting the pressure on us.
What about funding? Was the business community responding? Were you beginning to get support?
Some. I think they were taken aback a little bit by Grayson's rush to innovation, and we're holding back a little bit.
Even those most eager for change, like Bill Clements and
even
Cox.
Those most eager for change were a little bit hesitant. The university was funding the amount that we were spending over and above our normal budget. The Business School Foundation was responsible for that. Excuse me. That was a group of business people. And at one point, Bobby Lyle and Ed Cox did get the business community to come forward and fund the entire deficit, which was, in those days, $600,000 or $700,000, which was a lot of money, more than the annual budget of the school.
A little bit of that, Gene, was the remodeling of the Fincher building. And I remember that the school went out and began buying computers, for example, and setting up a computer lab where computer labs didn't exist on campus up to that time. So there were capital expenditures.
There were capital expenditures. Some of those were funded in part by business people. So we got a lot of help, but we needed something really significant. And Jack's being in Washington, D.C. and having an interim dean and not sure about accreditation, there were a number of clouds that kind of made donors who were inclined to make large gifts just a bit reluctant to make that commitment. Mm-hmm. So we were struggling there from a funds standpoint, and then it kind of got resolved when Jack decided to resign and Bobby Lyle had already resigned, and so we went into a search for a new dean, and so the business community was waiting anxiously to see who might be appointed.
See what was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you all had stirred the pot rather vigorously.
Yes.
But in curriculum terms, we got in some difficulty then with the AACSB.
We did.
In faculty terms, we got in trouble with the old guard, people who didn't feel that they were part of the in-group.
Yes.
And the funding didn't fully come forward as one might have hoped for.
We had one other problem, Carter. We decided that tenure was not something we could live with. We thought we had enough innovation going to where we could invite people to accept rolling 5-year contracts, no tenure anymore. We were not going to make any tenured appointments. We had trouble with people who were hanging around. Everybody knows about the problem of tenured professors who no longer produce, and there's not many of those, but we said, well, maybe we can innovate here as well. And we had a number of people who accepted, in lieu of a tenured position, rolling 5-year contracts. Well, the AAUP got wind of that, and after a couple of those, the provost, Neil McFarland, let us know in no uncertain terms that we couldn't do that anymore, and that those people who had the rolling 5-year contracts would in fact be granted a tenure. And so that was another innovation that didn't put us in.
Created a few enemies as
created
well
a few enemies. Didn't work.
Friends.
That didn't work as well.
Gene, even the departmental structure in the school was shaken up.
It was.
And it was my impression that you had adopted something like Tom Martin's grid system in the School of Engineering.
We did.
And that maybe this was partly to weaken the old departmental structure and make innovation easier to facilitate.
Carter, that's exactly right. The old structure was very entrenched. It was very, very difficult to move. Making moves with department chairs, replacing people was ugly and didn't work very well. And so rather than fight those battles, we just created an entire new structure. We called things subject areas instead of departments, and that gave us an opportunity to name our own subject area chairman. So some of the people who had been department chairman in the new structure didn't hold the subject area chairmanship, and we combined that in Tom's matrix area with both research or institute type work. So you could hold membership in a research area and a subject area at the same time. Mm-hmm. And we received approval of that through the provost's office, and we were able to go ahead and eliminate the departmental structure and work with a matrix structure.
This was a revolution going on in that school at SMU. We have to move on, and there came the time of Jack Grayson's departure. I know about as much about that as most people because I was in Washington at the time he was named the director of the Office of Wage and Price Stabilization. President Nixon had frozen all wages and prices as of Saturday night on the 5th of August. In 1971, and the search went out for a director of the office that would implement that. Jack's name came forward, and he was named. I remember his arriving in Washington one day, and we had lunch. Was the only time I saw him, but he was looking for office space. He was looking for personnel. He was just trying to get his feet on the ground. But he did a good job in that office, I think everyone felt. Now, in '75, he returned to SMU, but Bobby Lyle had been interim dean in the meanwhile.
Done a good job.
Without much authority, actually, from the central administration, hadn't he?
And Jack came back, and as I may have mentioned earlier, while he was in Washington, of course, the way that companies were able to get approval for price increases was to prove productivity in their companies. And Jack became thrilled with the idea that productivity was going to be a new wave for American business, and came back to SMU convinced that the creation of a productivity center would further enhance SMU's image as problem solvers and add to the whole action learning mix. And he tried to get a few business people interested, and he did get some, and the university agreed to let him spend his time working there. And as I said, along about that time, Bobby Lyle left, and Jack wasn't making great progress on his productivity center concept. He had some money from J.C. Penney and from IBM, but nothing along the lines that he needed to make it a success. And a Houston real estate developer had heard about it, came up, talked to Jack, and said, "I can make your idea happen, but you'll have to come to Houston and leave the university, and I'll help you create a productivity center, and I'll make sure it's well funded." Well, Jack couldn't look.
Resist
He
that.
couldn't resist. So he resigned, and left in February, and he resigned in November. Alan Coleman was asked to be acting dean on top of being executive dean. They put in a search committee, and it was very, very quickly they realized they had the man for the job right on campus in Alan Coleman, who had a lot of experience.
We need to deal with the Alan Coleman period. Just quickly, did Jack reassume the deanship when he came back from Bobby Lyle, or?
In name, but he really let Alan Coleman run the school. And Bobby Lyle told Jack, "I'm about to leave, so you need to appoint a new executive dean."
And so Alan was appointed
Alan
at
was
that
appointed,
point.
and he ran the school. He really did.
Did you remain then as associate dean throughout Alan Coleman's deanship?
I did not. I had, earlier had gone and became director of research. And while Coleman was dean, he had people like Dick Hansen and Bob Frame, two outstanding people. They were associate dean for undergraduate and graduate studies, and he moved along with those people during the period in which they were dealing with the accreditation problem, which was Alan's major problem when he accepted the deanship. One of his major problems.
So Alan had to face the AACSB,
He did.
and how did it come out?
Well, he persuaded the business school assembly, consisting of the faculty and students, that we faced loss of accreditation, and that the only real way to deal with that was to retain as much as we could of the innovations and make a bow toward the AACSB. And we had a curriculum committee that created a new curriculum consisting of the minimum number of required courses that the AACSB required. Alan went to a meeting in April and assured them that it was coming. Don't take away our accreditation. And in his statesmanlike manner, was able to persuade them to wait. And in the summer, he delivered that undergraduate required curriculum to the AACSB, and they thankfully continued our accreditation. So we never lost a day of accreditation at the undergraduate level.
But concessions had to be made in terms of some of the innovation.
We did, yes.
What about the MBA programs?
The MBA program was not accredited. We had a required, you had to take marketing, you had to take all the basic courses, and then you could choose your elective. So we just about fit in under the umbrella that the AACSB had created. And Alan Coleman was able to, again, in his very statesmanlike manner, and partly because they saw the hard work he did in getting the undergraduate program back into the fold, they let him, they accredited the graduate program as well. So we had both programs accredited, and then Alan set about raising money to fund chairs. We only had one, and Alan was very, very active in funding chairs after the two programs were accredited. He devoted his time to that activity.
Well, Alan certainly built on what you and Jack had created, and catapulted the school into a position of national prominence, I think. The executive MBA program was born at that time, was it not?
At that time, yes, it was. Again, the advisory board being very, very constantly talked about that, and Alan saw the value to that for a number of different reasons. And during his earliest career, part of his career as dean, created the executive MBA. We may have been one of the first regionally, and maybe even nationally, to put in an executive MBA. Certainly among the first in Texas. So we had a good jump, and we had people from all over. We had an outstanding set of students. In fact, the Jack Murphy, who later became the chairman of Dresser, was one of them. The head of Compact Computer, his name escapes me at the moment, a German, Gerhard Pfeiffer, was one of our executive MBAs, and numerous of our MBA students came in at very, very high levels, executives coming into the MBA program to get a degree, and we were very, very proud of that, and it continues today.
This was part of the payoff then of our relationships with the business community.
Was. It was.
In the minute or two we have left, Gene, how would you characterize then the period in which you and Jack Grayson first came to SMU, and Alan Coleman's period, and perhaps Roy Herberger's deanship that followed?
Well, I think Jack was charged with making the school something that it hadn't been for quite a while, and I think he chose a very, very innovative approach. I think action learning today is a very part of the American educational scene. If you look at the University of Phoenix today, which is a very popular program, you'll see that that's their main thrust is action-oriented education. Alan Coleman was a quality faculty person and oriented himself toward that, and Roy Herberger was a builder. So without Roy, I think we wouldn't have the physical facilities. He immediately understood what we needed, and Roy was excellent at getting people to commit to that on top of what Alan Coleman had built.
Gene, it's been a great conversation. I wish we had another hour or two to continue it. Thanks for participating and helping us record these go-go years in the School of Business, when that school changed from a rather sleepy part of the campus to one of the university's strong points.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here with you. As a friend and respected colleague, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Okay.